was a quiet Sunday morning, June 1st, 1862. Eliza Cogar stirred awake, stretching beneath the warm glow of the rising sun. The day promised nothing but peace. He planned to spend the morning down by the creek on his property, accompanied by his wife, Nancy, and their 2 young children. But fate had other plans. Without warning, gunshots shattered the morning calm. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of their home, splintering furniture and filling the air with screams. A band of armed men had materialized outside, their rifles trained on the Cogar household like executioners at a firing line. Nancy's scream pierced through the chaos. "Run, Elijah!" she cried, clutching their terrified children. Elijah didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the door, desperate to escape. But he never made it far. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure bearing down on him, riding fast, like death itself. The rider was Ferguson. Before Elijah could react, the man raised his firearm and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. Pain erupted through Elijah's body as the bullet struck. Staggering, he barely registered the agony. Adrenaline surged, forcing his legs to move despite the searing wound. He turned and sprinted toward the fence line, his only hope for survival. 50 yards. That was all that separated him from a chance, however slim, of making it out alive. Behind him, hooves thundered against the earth. 9 other men rode alongside Ferguson, their guns primed, their eyes fixed on their prey. Elijah reached the fence. His fingers gripped the rough wood, his body trembling as he struggled to pull himself over. But it was too late. Ferguson rode up, leveled his weapon, and fired. By the time Nancy reached the fence, their 11-year-old daughter Sarah had already fought her way through the group of men. She had dropped to her knees beside her father, cradling his bloody, lifeless body in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed over the man who had once protected her from the world. Nancy knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she touched Elijah's still warm skin. A faint, gasping breath rattled from his lips, but no words came. His life faded in that moment, stolen away under the morning sun. Behind them, laughter echoed from the house. Ferguson and his men ransacked the Cogar home, taking everything of value: silverware, coins, their only horse. They left nothing but destruction in their wake. And this was only the beginning. This is the story of Champ Ferguson, the man who killed for pleasure. And once he was convicted, was Champ Ferguson truly executed? Or did a deeper conspiracy ensure his survival? Samuel Champ Ferguson was born and raised in the rugged Cumberland Mountains of southern Kentucky, right near the northeastern border of Tennessee. It was a wild land, a place where the rules of civilization often failed to reach. It was the same region that had once been home to the legendary frontiersman Davy Crockett. Before the Civil War, Ferguson was, by all accounts, an unassuming farmer. For over 20 years, he worked the land to provide for his family. But farming wasn't his only skill. He was an avid hunter, skilled, patient, and deadly. For him, hunting wasn't just a pastime. It was a way of life. It fed his family and gave him an intimate knowledge of the dense forests and treacherous foothills of the Cumberland Mountains. That knowledge would later serve him well. When the time came to evade the Union guerrillas and federal soldiers who would stop at nothing to bring him down. But Champ Ferguson was no ordinary man. There was something different about him, whether it was inherited from his father or born from some dark recess of his soul. The venom that coursed through his veins was well known long before the war. It all started in 1858. That year, a man named Floyd Evans made a simple mistake. He failed to pay a debt on time after purchasing livestock from Ferguson. A mistake, yes, but one that would cost him far more than money. In a fit of anger, Ferguson didn't go after Floyd. Instead, he tracked down Floyd's twin brother, Alex Evans, ambushing him in the wilderness and stealing his horse as payment. Now, in those days, a horse wasn't just a means of transportation, it was survival. Losing a horse could mean financial ruin or even death. It was a crime taken as seriously as murder. Floyd Evans eventually gathered the money and repaid his debt, but his brother, Alex, wasn't about to let Ferguson's theft go unanswered. He filed a lawsuit against him, demanding justice. And when the Evans brothers began speaking out against him, Ferguson saw it as a direct threat to his life. The Fentress County Court issued a warrant for Ferguson's arrest, but he wasn't the type to surrender easily. He moved in and out of the county, acting as if the warrant didn't exist. That is, until August of that year, when the law finally caught up with him. Ferguson was attending a religious camp meeting when he was spotted by the county constable, Jim Reed. Seeing his chance, Reed moved in to arrest him. Several men in the crowd joined the effort. Ferguson saw the danger and ran. He mounted his young horse and tried to escape, but the men weren't about to let him go so easily. They gave chase, hurling rocks at him. One struck its target. His horse stumbled, throwing Ferguson to the ground. He barely had time to react before Jim Reed was on him, but Ferguson wasn't done fighting. In a flash, he drew a pocket knife and slashed at the constable. 1, 2, 3 deep cuts. Before Reed could even scream, the blade had done its job. Blood poured onto the dirt as the lawman collapsed, dead. Ferguson didn't stop there. He turned the knife on Floyd Evans, slashing and stabbing until the man lay bleeding on the ground, barely clinging to life. Then without hesitation, Ferguson fled into a nearby farmhouse. But there was no escape this time. A furious mob gathered outside, ready to tear him apart. Realizing he wouldn't make it out alive, Ferguson made a choice. He surrendered himself to the Fentress County Sheriff, demanding a fair trial. The local magistrate, James Zachary Sr., ordered him in prison. He spent 2 months behind bars before his family secured his bail at a hefty price. They put up a significant portion of their land as collateral. Ferguson knew he needed a strong defense, and he found it in a sharp, well-connected attorney named Scott Bledsoe. His trial was set for January of the following year, but somehow it never happened. No one knows exactly how he did it, but Bledsoe managed to delay the trial again and again. And by the time nearly 3 years had passed, the world had changed. The South had seceded from the Union. The Civil War had begun. Ferguson found himself at odds with nearly everyone he had ever known. His 9 brothers and sisters, his mother, and most of his friends and neighbors. They were Union supporters. He, however, threw his lot in with the Confederacy, and from that moment forward, Ferguson was no longer just a fugitive. He was a killer with a cause. Was he really executed, or was there a conspiracy to save his life? Samuel Champ Ferguson grew up in the rugged, untamed wilderness of the Cumberland Mountains, straddling the border between southern Kentucky and northeastern Tennessee. It was a region once inhabited by legendary frontiersmen like Davy Crockett, an unforgiving land of towering peaks, dense forests, and winding rivers. For more than 20 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, Ferguson was a simple farmer by trade, working the land to provide for his family. But when he wasn't tending to his crops, he spent much of his time hunting, an activity that not only took him deep into the mountains he loved, but also ensured his family had food on the table. Through years of long hunting excursions, Ferguson developed an intimate knowledge of the foothills and mountain passes, a skill that would later prove invaluable. When the war came and he became a hunted man, this knowledge allowed him to elude his enemies, Union guerrillas and Federal soldiers who pursued him with relentless determination. Yet, even before the war, Ferguson had a reputation, one not of a hero or a noble warrior, but of something far darker. His violent tendencies were well known in his community, whether inherited from his father or something that lurked deep within his own nature. His notorious behavior first made headlines in 1858 with an incident that foreshadowed the brutality to come. It all started with a debt. That year, a man named Floyd Evans bought livestock from Champ Ferguson, but when Evans failed to pay his debt on time, Ferguson didn't just demand payment, he sought revenge. Rather than going after Floyd directly, Ferguson tracked down and ambushed his twin brother, Alex Evans, attacking him and stealing his horse as compensation. At that time, a horse was not just a valuable possession, it was often a man's livelihood, essential for farming, transportation, and survival. Horse theft was a serious crime, one that could lead to swift and brutal retribution. Floyd Evans eventually settled his debt, but his brother Alex refused to let the matter go. He pressed charges, filing a lawsuit against Ferguson for stealing his horse. As the case moved forward, the Evans brothers began speaking out against Ferguson, and soon enough, the situation escalated. To Ferguson, public accusations weren't just an insult, they were a direct threat to his life. The feud between them reached a boiling point when the Fentress County Court issued a warrant for Ferguson's arrest. But rather than turning himself in, Champ simply ignored the law, continuing to move freely in and out of the county as if nothing had happened. That August, Ferguson attended a religious camp meeting, perhaps hoping to blend into the crowd and avoid his legal troubles. But as he was leaving, the local constable Jim Reed spotted him and seized the opportunity. Gathering a group of men, Reed moved in to arrest him. Ferguson, realizing what was happening, made a desperate attempt to flee. He mounted his horse and took off, but the men gave chase, pelting him with rocks as they pursued him. His horse stumbled, and suddenly he was on foot, running for his life. Constable Reed was the first to catch up to him, but before he could lay a hand on Ferguson, Champ pulled a pocket knife and, with lightning speed, began slashing wildly. He stabbed the constable over and over until Reed collapsed, bleeding out in the dirt. The crowd watched in horror as Ferguson, still fueled by rage, turned on Floyd Evans, stabbing him as well and leaving him critically wounded before vanishing into the woods. With the mob now out for his blood, Ferguson realized he had no choice but to surrender. Under the pretense of seeking a fair trial, he turned himself into the Fentress County Sheriff. Magistrate James Zachary Sr. ordered his imprisonment, and Ferguson spent 2 months in jail before his family secured his bail, using a significant portion of their land as collateral. The trial for the killing of Constable Jim Reed was set for January, but that trial would never happen. Ferguson had an advantage, a powerful and well-connected attorney named Scott Bledsoe. Somehow, whether through legal maneuvering or backroom deals, Bledsoe managed to delay the trial again and again. Before long, 3 years had passed and the entire country had changed. The South had seceded from the Union and war had erupted across the nation. It is speculated that Bledsoe's influence, or perhaps Ferguson's sense of obligation to the man who had kept him out of prison, drove him to side with the Confederacy. But this decision put him at odds with nearly everyone he knew. His mother, his siblings, his friends, and most of his neighbors all supported the Union cause. They viewed his decision to fight for the South as an unforgivable betrayal. Yet, political loyalties in the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky were rarely about ideology alone. The Civil War wasn't just North versus South. It was often neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, and as the war raged on, personal grudges, old feuds, and long-standing animosities boiled over into open violence. Ferguson, however, wasn't just another Confederate soldier. He was something else entirely. He would go on to become one of the most feared and brutal guerrilla fighters of the war, a man whose name would be spoken in hushed tones, a man whose very presence struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. But was he a ruthless killer, a cold-blooded murderer who reveled in violence, or was he something else? Perhaps a man caught in the chaos of war, doing whatever he had to do to survive. That's the question history struggles to answer. And as for his ultimate fate, was he truly executed for his crimes, or was there a conspiracy to save his life? The truth may be more complicated than we think. Understanding the social and political attitudes of the time is crucial in uncovering some of the deeper motivations behind Champ Ferguson's violent path. The 1850s were an era of intense division in the United States, with tensions over slavery reaching a boiling point. The question of whether slavery should expand into new Western territories sparked fierce debates between the two dominant political coalitions of the time, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats were staunch advocates for the expansion of slavery, believing it to be an economic necessity, while their northern counterparts argued that each new territory should have the right to decide for itself. In response to this growing schism, the Republican Party was formed in 1854, a mere 7 years before the onset of the Civil War. This new political faction was composed of anti-slavery Whigs, disaffected members of the Know Nothing Party, and others who opposed the spread of slavery. Despite being a fledgling party, the Republicans quickly gained traction, particularly in the North. Within a short period, two of the presidential candidates secured election victories. However, their rise was met with fierce resistance. When Abraham Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president in 1860, it sent shockwaves throughout the country. Though he received less than 40% of the popular vote, his election signaled a turning point. To many in the South, Lincoln was the embodiment of an abolitionist threat, even though his campaign rhetoric had been more about holding the expansion of slavery rather than abolishing it outright. Lincoln himself wrestled with the moral contradictions of the nation's foundation, one built on the principle that all men are created equal, while simultaneously upholding the institution of slavery. In private letters, he expressed his disdain for the hypocrisy, writing in 1855 to his friend Joshua Speed, "When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for example, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Yet, despite his personal convictions, Lincoln and many within his party initially hesitated to take a hard stance on abolition. Their primary goal was to prevent the Union from fracturing. However, the deep divisions over slavery proved impossible to contain. The issue at hand was not just slavery itself, but whether new territories would be permitted to adopt it as settlers moved westward. Many farmers without slaves saw the expansion of forced labor as an unfair economic advantage for plantation owners. As Lincoln took office, southern states saw the writing on the wall. Fearing the curtailment of slavery, they began to secede from the Union, leading to an all-out war. Amid this chaos, men like Champ Ferguson found themselves drawn into the conflict, whether by ideology, survival, or personal vendetta. Though Ferguson's exact reasons for joining the Confederacy remain murky, some historians speculate that his allegiance was more pragmatic than ideological. He had already been entangled in legal troubles, including the killing of a local constable, and some believe he struck a bargain with Confederate authorities. If he fought for their cause, his past crimes would be overlooked. Whether this promise was ever officially made remains unknown, but what is clear is that Ferguson quickly became one of the most notorious and ruthless guerrilla fighters in the war. Tennessee's secession in June of 1861 transformed the state into a battlefield of divided loyalties. The eastern region, in particular, saw vicious skirmishes between Union and Confederate sympathizers long before official armies clashed. Lawlessness ran rampant, and personal feuds were often settled under the guise of wartime conflict. In the mountainous regions, where families had long practiced their own form of vigilante justice, the war was less about ideology and more about survival. As the war progressed, Ferguson's brutality became legendary. He was not merely targeting soldiers on the battlefield. His vendetta extended to civilians, old acquaintances, and even former friends. Anyone he suspected of supporting the Union became a potential target. One account described how Ferguson went so far as to raid a courthouse and remove official records detailing his past crimes, effectively erasing them from history. The violence only escalated as the war continued. By the time Ferguson officially enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1864, he had already claimed the lives of dozens, if not hundreds, of men. Unlike traditional soldiers who engaged in formal battles, Ferguson operated in the shadows, carrying out brutal ambushes and executing prisoners without hesitation. Journalist James Johnson, writing for the Nashville Dispatch in October 1865, provided a chilling account of Ferguson's reign of terror. The wounded, the sick, the aged, and even helpless childhood were not spared from his brutal murders. He thought, he says, that he was engaged in legitimate warfare. We were having a sort of miscellaneous war up there, through Fentress County, Tennessee, in Clinton County, Kentucky, and all through that region. Every man was in danger of his life. If I hadn't killed my neighbor, he would have killed me. Each of us had from 20 to 50 proscribed enemies, and it was regarded as legitimate to kill them at any time, at any place, under any circumstances, even if they were wounded or on a sickbed. By the end of 1861, Ferguson had transformed from a man seeking self-preservation into a cold-blooded killer driven by vengeance. His personal war continued, even when his own family's safety was at risk. On one occasion, he reportedly stole a horse at gunpoint from a local man, nearly killing him in the process. for allegedly being a Lincoln supporter. His violence was not reserved solely for enemies. He even turned on old friends. One of the most shocking betrayals was his murder of Reuben Wood, a longtime friend of the Ferguson family. Wood had once saved Ferguson's life, intervening to prevent the mob from executing him after his fatal altercation with a constable. However, when the war broke out, Wood found himself associated with Union forces, aligning with the same company as Ferguson's younger brother, Jim. To Ferguson, loyalty was absolute. Once Wood had chosen a side, their past friendship meant nothing. Ferguson and his Confederate associates ambushed Wood as he returned home one evening, setting the stage for yet another brutal execution, one driven not by strategy, but by Ferguson's insatiable thirst for blood. The Appalachian Mountains had long been a land of strife. Before the war, disputes were settled with fists, knives, or bullets, often over livestock, women, politics, or simple thievery. But when the Civil War broke out, it didn't just divide states, it divided households. For men like Champ Ferguson, the war wasn't fought on battlefields between organized armies. It was fought on the front porches of old friends, in the shadows of familiar woods, in the same valleys where they had grown up. The mountains followed a different code. When a man chose a side, all ties were severed. Family, friends, anyone who stood on the opposite side became the enemy. Blood feuds took on a new, darker purpose under the guise of war. By the spring of 1862, the Cumberland Mountains were drowning in violence. Union supporters clashed with Confederate sympathizers in a chaotic, lawless struggle. With the arrival of Union troops in Tennessee, tensions escalated even further, and for Champ Ferguson, the war became personal. His hatred for Abraham Lincoln, the federal government, and anyone who supported the Union festered into something else, something darker. But why? Why did Champ Ferguson choose the Confederacy when so many around him, his own family included, stood with the Union? The truth is clouded by contradictions. According to Ferguson himself, he hadn't always been a Confederate loyalist. In fact, he claimed that he had been a Union man until he killed the constable. That killing had put him in danger of legal prosecution. But when the war broke out, a bargain was offered. If he joined the Confederacy, all charges against him would disappear. And so, according to his own words, that's how he took up arms. Others speculated that his loyalty was tied to Scott Bledsoe, a man he respected who may have promised him immunity in exchange for his service. But whatever the reason, one thing was clear. Champ Ferguson wasn't fighting for politics or even for the South. He was fighting for himself. Even though he wasn't officially enlisted until 1864, 3 years into the war, he had already killed dozens of men, many of them civilians. His loyalty to the Confederacy seemed to solidify after the Confederate victory at Bull Run in 1861. To him, that victory was proof that he had chosen the winning side. But by late 1861, Ferguson's war was no longer about the Confederacy. It was a personal vendetta. He no longer cared whether a man was friend or family. If he believed someone supported the Union, that was enough. A reporter from the Nashville Dispatch, James Johnson, later described Ferguson's war in brutal terms. The wounded, the sick, the aged, and even helpless childhood were not spared from his murders. He thought he was engaged in legitimate warfare. We were having a sort of miscellaneous war up there. Every man was in danger of his life. If I hadn't killed my neighbor, he would have killed me. Each of us had from 20 to 50 prescribed enemies, and it was regarded as legitimate to kill them at any time, at any place, under any circumstances, even if they were wounded or on the sickbed. Champ Ferguson took that philosophy to heart. On December 2nd, he stole a horse at gunpoint from a man he suspected of being a Union supporter. Before riding off, he nearly killed him, cursing him as a damned Lincolnite. With 2 Confederate associates, he rode the stolen horse to the home of an old family friend, Reuben Wood. Wood had known Champ since he was a child. Years ago, he had even saved his life, stopping a mob from killing Ferguson after he stabbed a county constable to death. But the war had changed everything. Wood had been seen at Camp Robinson, a Union recruiting center. As Wood returned from feeding his animals, Ferguson and his men intercepted him on the road. Wood was unarmed. His daughter, Elizabeth, later recalled the moment. Ferguson spoke briefly, exchanging the usual pleasantries before his tone darkened. "I suppose you've been to Camp Robinson," Ferguson said. It wasn't a question. Wood, honest as ever, admitted that he had. Ferguson demanded to know why, but before Wood could respond, Ferguson interrupted with a string of curses. Nobody but a damned old Lincolnite would be caught at such a place. He spat. For several minutes, Ferguson ranted, growing angrier by the second. Then suddenly, he raised his pistol. "Down you pig," he sneered, "and don't you dodge." Wood's wife and daughter screamed from the porch, begging Ferguson to spare his life. Wood himself pleaded, reminding Champ of their long friendship, of how he had cared for him like family. For a moment Ferguson hesitated. "Reuben, you have always treated me like a gentleman," he admitted, but then his expression hardened. "But you have been to Camp Robinson, and I intend to kill you." He pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Wood in the chest. Somehow, despite the wound, Wood managed to stumble into his home. His wife and children could do nothing but watch as he suffered for 2 days before finally succumbing to his injuries. A month later, Ferguson rode again, this time to the home of another old friend, William Frog Esther. Frog's wife sat on the porch peeling apples when Ferguson arrived with 2 armed men. She greeted him kindly, offering him a seat and an apple, unaware of the blood already on his hands. Ferguson ignored her, stepping past her into the home. Inside, Frog lay in bed, too sick to even stand. Their 5-month-old child lay in a crib beside him. Ferguson loomed over him. "I reckon you caught the measles at Camp Dick Robinson," he sneered. Frog barely had time to react before Ferguson raised his Colt revolver. He fired twice. The bullets ripped through the bed covers as Frog weakly tried to shield his face. As was his routine, Ferguson then ransacked the house, searching for valuables before riding off into the night. By this point, Ferguson had turned his own community against him. His pro-unionist neighbors, already suspicious of his actions, now saw him for what he was, a killer. Even his own brother, Jim Ferguson, had joined the Union's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. The two had reportedly sworn to kill each other on sight. But Jim would never get the chance. A month after Reuben Wood's murder, Jim Ferguson was ambushed and killed. Reuben Wood's son, Robert, was not about to let his father's murderer go unpunished. He gathered a small band of armed men, hell-bent on one thing, killing Champ Ferguson. But Ferguson was already gone. He had fled south, crossing into secessionist Tennessee, where he joined the Confederate guerrilla band, led by none other than his former attorney, Scott Bledsoe. Although Ferguson had moved his family to Tennessee, he wasn't done with Kentucky. Again and again, he returned to the place he once called home, but each time he left behind more bodies. For Ferguson, the war had become an excuse to kill, and in the mountains, far from the battlefields, there were no rules, only survival. Reuben Wood was an unarmed man, a fact his daughter Elizabeth would later recount with sorrow and disbelief. The morning had started uneventfully as Wood encountered Champ Ferguson, a man he had known for years. The conversation began with casual pleasantries, a normal exchange between two acquaintances, but the atmosphere quickly shifted when Ferguson abruptly asked, "I suppose you've been to Camp Robinson?" A statement more than a question, heavy with accusation. Camp Robinson, a known recruitment center for the Union-aligned Home Guard, was a deeply divisive topic in their community. Confederate sympathizers like Ferguson regarded it as a traitorous institution, a breeding ground for those who supported the enemy. Wood, a man of honesty, admitted that he had indeed been there. That single truth sealed his fate. Ferguson's demeanor darkened. Without waiting for an explanation, he launched into a tirade. His voice thick with venom, he spat insults, calling Wood a damned old Lincolnite, and making it clear that no man of his kind should have been anywhere near Camp Robinson. His words slashed through the air, filled with the kind of rage that could only end in violence. Then, as if possessed by the force of his own hatred, Ferguson drew his pistol and leveled it at Wood's chest. "Don't you run, Reuben," he warned, his voice a deadly whisper. "And don't you dodge." Wood's wife and daughter, standing helplessly on the porch, screamed in desperation. They pleaded with Ferguson to spare his life, reminding him of their shared past, of the long years their families had known one another. Even Wood himself, sensing the inevitability of his fate, tried to appeal to whatever sliver of humanity remained in Ferguson's heart. "Champ," he implored, "I nursed you when you were a baby." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Ferguson sneered. "Reuben, you have always treated me like a gentleman," he admitted, almost as if he were offering a farewell. "But you've been to Camp Robinson, and I intend to kill you." With that, he pulled the trigger. The bullet tore into Wood's chest, but he did not die instantly. Staggering backward, he somehow found the strength to retreat into his home, collapsing in the arms of his horrified wife and children. For 2 agonizing days, he clung to life, writhing in pain, as his family watched, powerless to help him. Finally, the wound claimed him, and Reuben Wood was no more. But his murder was only the beginning. Wood himself pleaded, reminding Champ of their long friendship, of how he had cared for him like family. For a moment Ferguson hesitated. "Reuben, you have always treated me like a gentleman," he admitted, but then his expression hardened. "But you have been to Camp Robinson, and I intend to kill you." He pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Wood in the chest. Somehow, despite the wound, Wood managed to stumble into his home. His wife and children could do nothing but watch as he suffered for 2 days before finally succumbing to his injuries. A month later, Ferguson rode again, this time to the home of another old friend, William "Frog" Esther. Frog's wife sat on the porch peeling apples when Ferguson arrived with 2 armed men. She greeted him kindly, offering him a seat and an apple, unaware of the blood already on his hands. Ferguson ignored her, stepping past her into the home. Inside, Frog lay in bed, too sick to even stand. Their 5-month-old child lay in a crib beside him. Ferguson loomed over him. "I reckon you caught the measles at Camp Dick Robinson," he sneered. Frog barely had time to react before Ferguson raised his Colt revolver. He fired twice. The bullets ripped through the bed covers as Frog weakly tried to shield his face. As was his routine, Ferguson then ransacked the house, searching for valuables before riding off into the night. By this point, Ferguson had turned his own community against him. His pro-unionist neighbors, already suspicious of his actions, now saw him for what he was, a killer. Even his own brother, Jim Ferguson, had joined the Union's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. The two had reportedly sworn to kill each other on sight. But Jim would never get the chance. A month after Reuben Wood's murder, Jim Ferguson was ambushed and killed. Reuben Wood's son, Robert, was not about to let his father's murderer go unpunished. He gathered a small band of armed men, hell-bent on one thing, killing Champ Ferguson. But Ferguson was already gone. He had fled south, crossing into secessionist Tennessee, where he joined a Confederate guerrilla band, led by none other than his former attorney, Scott Bledsoe. Although Ferguson had moved his family to Tennessee, he wasn't done with Kentucky. Again and again, he returned to the place he once called home, but each time he left behind more bodies. For Ferguson, the war had become an excuse to kill, and in the mountains, far from the battlefields, there were no rules, only survival. Reuben Wood was an unarmed man, a fact his daughter Elizabeth would later recount with sorrow and disbelief. The morning had started uneventfully as Wood encountered Champ Ferguson, a man he had known for years. The conversation began with casual pleasantries, a normal exchange between two acquaintances, but the atmosphere quickly shifted when Ferguson abruptly asked, "I suppose you've been to Camp Robinson?" A statement more than a question, heavy with accusation. Camp Robinson, a known recruitment center for the Union-aligned Home Guard, was a deeply divisive topic in their community. Confederate sympathizers like Ferguson regarded it as a traitorous institution, a breeding ground for those who supported the enemy. Wood, a man of honesty, admitted that he had indeed been there. That single truth sealed his fate. Ferguson's demeanor darkened. Without waiting for an explanation, he launched into a tirade. His voice thick with venom, he spat insults, calling Wood a damned old Lincolnite, and making it clear that no man of his kind should have been anywhere near Camp Robinson. His words slashed through the air, filled with the kind of rage that could only end in violence. Then, as if possessed by the force of his own hatred, Ferguson drew his pistol and leveled it at Wood's chest. "Don't you run, Reuben," he warned, his voice a deadly whisper. "And don't you dodge." Wood's wife and daughter, standing helplessly on the porch, screamed in desperation. They pleaded with Ferguson to spare his life, reminding him of their shared past, of the long years their families had known one another. Even Wood himself, sensing the inevitability of his fate, tried to appeal to whatever sliver of humanity remained in Ferguson's heart. "Champ," he implored, "I nursed you when you were a baby." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Ferguson sneered. "Reuben, you have always treated me like a gentleman," he admitted, almost as if he were offering a farewell. "But you've been to Camp Robinson, and I intend to kill you." With that, he pulled the trigger. The bullet tore into Wood's chest, but he did not die instantly. Staggering backward, he somehow found the strength to retreat into his home, collapsing in the arms of his horrified wife and children. For 2 agonizing days, he clung to life, writhing in pain as his family watched, powerless to help him. Finally, the wound claimed him, and Reuben Wood was no more. But his murder was only the beginning. April 1st would be remembered as a day of reckoning, not for those who sought to bring peace, but for those who had dared to stand in Ferguson's way. The bloodshed began in Fentress County, where Champ and his fellow guerrillas, many of them former members of Scott Bledsoe's men, carried out a brutal campaign of execution. By the time the sun had set, 5 men lay dead, their bodies riddled with bullets and knife wounds, a grim testament to Ferguson's merciless wrath. Among the slain were 4 men who had stood as representatives for the Union during the Monroe Peace Meeting: Joseph Stover, William Johnson, Robert Martin, and Lewis Pierce. To Ferguson, their attempt at diplomacy had been an act of treachery, a reason to make an example of them. The details of their deaths, later recounted in court documents, painted a horrific picture of Ferguson's brand of justice. Joseph Stover was reportedly killed in a gunfight, though the circumstances remained unclear. Robert Martin and Lewis Pierce had been given no such chance to defend themselves. They had tried to run, but it had been futile. Pierce, in particular, had barely made it a few yards before he was gunned down with a double-barreled shotgun, his body found riddled with both gunshot and stab wounds, his heart pierced through. William Johnson, a Union soldier on leave, had been staying at his father's house when Ferguson's men arrived. Upon seeing them, he had fled toward a nearby bluff, perhaps hoping to escape into the thick forest below. Instead, he had been chased to the edge and forced over, plummeting 40 to 50 feet before his pursuers stood above and fired down at his broken body. Ferguson later claimed these men had all been Home Guard members plotting to kill him. Whether or not that was true, they had been no match for the fury he had unleashed upon them. But Ferguson was not finished. His final victim that day was not a battle-hardened soldier, nor an armed Home Guard member. It was a boy, just a youth, barely old enough to be called a man. Near Spring Creek, Kentucky, Ferguson encountered 16-year-old Found Zachary. Some reports from the time, sensationalized by newspapers such as the Nashville Dispatch, would later claim the boy had been as young as 12. Regardless of his exact age, he was no match for Ferguson's cruelty. Found Zachary was not a soldier. He was not even an active participant in the war. What he was, however, was the grandson of James Zachary Sr., the magistrate who had once imprisoned Ferguson for the killing of Constable Jim Reed before the war. That was all the justification Ferguson needed. The encounter was not a battle, it was an execution. Ferguson, seizing his opportunity for revenge, cut the boy down without hesitation. For Ferguson, these killings were not just acts of war. They were deeply personal, they were vengeance, and they were far from over. As the sun dipped below the horizon on April 1st, 1862, the sky burned in shades of orange and red, as if foreshadowing the bloodshed to come. The Civil War had raged for nearly a year, but for young Found Zachary, the conflict wasn't some distant affair. It was right outside his doorstep. Seated atop his horse, he kept watch along a narrow, dust-choked road leading out of Albany, Kentucky, stretching into Tennessee. The land was silent, save for the occasional rustling of trees and the distant calls of night birds. But beneath the stillness lurked a growing fear. Guerrilla fighters, ruthless and unpredictable, had been striking the region with increasing brutality. That very day, several men had already fallen victim to the raids. Despite being just 16, 2 years too young for formal service, Found had volunteered as a picket for the local Home Guard, a pro-Union militia tasked with watching the roads and warning friendly forces of any Confederate activity. He had taken up his post with pride, gripping his shotgun, eager to prove himself. Then, from the distance, the sound of hooves. A group of riders approached, their dark figures barely visible in the fading twilight. Found steered his horse forward, emerging from the thicket to meet them. "All clear," he announced, his voice steady, assuming these were fellow Home Guardsmen. But as they drew closer, his stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Their faces, shadow but unmistakably hardened, were not familiar. Their expressions were cold, and then he saw their weapons. Before he could react, one of the riders stepped forward. "Hand over the shotgun," the man demanded. Found hesitated, but he had no choice. Slowly, he unshouldered his firearm and handed it over, reaching for his shot pouch next. Then another man moved toward him. His gait was deliberate, his presence suffocating. "What's your name, boy?" the man asked, his voice dripping with something between curiosity and menace. "Found Zachary," he answered, without hesitation. And then silence. A cruel smirk crossed the man's lips as his fingers coiled around the grip of his revolver. Had Found known the danger he was in, he might have lied, might have bolted, might have begged for his life. But he didn't. The name Zachary was well known to this man. Champ Ferguson, James Zachary, Found's grandfather, had once imprisoned Champ, ensuring his trial for a murder he had committed before the war. That act of justice had been a thorn in Champ's side for years. Now, revenge had come knocking. Without another word, Champ drew his pistol and fired. The shot rang out in the evening air, and Found's body lurched, tumbling from his horse. He hit the ground hard, his breath ragged, pain searing through his chest. But Champ wasn't done. Dismounting, he walked toward the wounded boy, his boots crunching against the gravel. In his hand, he gripped a long gleaming bowie knife. Found gasped, his young body trembling as Champ knelt beside him. No words, no hesitation. With cold precision, Champ drove the knife straight into Found's heart. The blade cut deep, twisting, ensuring there would be no survival. The boy's body shuddered once, then fell still. Champ wiped the blood from his blade and stood, casting one last glance at his victim. Another name struck from his list, another grudge settled. This was just the beginning. Champ Ferguson was no ordinary soldier. While the American Civil War raged across the country, he had turned the Cumberland Plateau, a rugged, mountainous stretch along the Kentucky-Tennessee border, into his own personal hunting ground. Before the war, Champ had been awaiting trial for the brutal killing of a local constable, Jim Reed, who had attempted to arrest him for horse theft. Champ's family had leveraged much of their land to secure his bail, leaving him a free man as his case dragged through the courts. Then the war broke out, and the trial never came. With the world thrown into chaos, Champ found a new purpose. He wasn't interested in grand ideals, patriotism, or state loyalty. He wasn't fighting for the Confederacy because of politics. He was fighting for himself. All grudges, personal feuds, long-standing rivalries, all could now be settled under the guise of war. According to historian Brian D. McKnight, in his book Confederate Outlaw, Champ's decision to enlist wasn't just about picking a side. His attorney, Willie Scott Bledsoe, had secured his release from prosecution, possibly in exchange for his loyalty to the Confederacy. Whether out of gratitude or a sense of obligation, Champ Ferguson became one of the bloodiest figures of the war. His rampage would know no bounds. Although the main battles of the war were fought far from the Cumberland Plateau, the region was drowning in lawless violence. Bands of Union and Confederate guerrillas roamed the countryside, launching raids, ambushes, and retaliatory attacks. For civilians caught in the crossfire, there was no safe haven. In March 1862, a desperate attempt at peace was made. A meeting was called in Monroe, Tennessee, bringing together local leaders from both sides, Unionists and Confederates alike, to discuss a way to stem the bloodshed. Among those in attendance were men Champ Ferguson had already marked for death: Tinker Dave Beatty, James Zachary, Thomas Wood, Eliza Cogar. These men had already earned Champ's hatred simply for their allegiance to the Union. But now they had dared to seek peace, and for that he would make them pay. This was no war to Champ Ferguson. This was vengeance. According to author Brian McKnight, Confederate Captain James McHenry, a notorious guerrilla leader, outright refused to abide by the so-called gentleman's agreement that was meant to ease the relentless bloodshed between Union and Confederate factions. As a result, guerrilla warfare erupted once again in Clinton County, Kentucky, within days of the meeting at Monroe. Under Captain McHenry's command, Champ Ferguson and his ruthless band of fighters unleashed their fury, leaving 4 men dead in Clinton County on April 1st. The 5th victim would be a young boy, Fount Zachary, whose murder would later haunt Ferguson during his trial in 1865. Champ himself admitted to the killing, claiming he had no choice. He testified that as soon as the boy emerged from a nearby thicket, he fired, following direct orders from his Confederate commander, Jim McHenry, who had allegedly instructed his men to shoot anyone seen carrying a firearm. But was it really that simple? John A. Capps, one of Champ's own men, recounted a far more brutal version of the event. He testified that the moment young Fount Zachary said his name, Ferguson shot him. The boy fell from his horse, but Ferguson wasn't finished. He walked over, unsheathed his knife, and plunged it into the helpless boy's body. Capps, who had been standing just 10 to 15 feet away, recalled the gruesome moment in chilling detail. When Ferguson stabbed him, he said, "I heard a sort of rough, grating sound that I hardly know how to describe." They left the boy's lifeless body sprawled on the ground. Under cross-examination, Capps made another damning revelation. McHenry's orders had not included shooting anyone who had surrendered their firearms. This directly contradicted Champ's claim that he had simply been following orders. To make matters worse, it was none other than Champ's own mother-in-law, Widow Owen, who recovered the boy's corpse from the road. She kept his lifeless body in her home until his family could arrive to claim him. But for the Zachary clan, this was only the beginning. Fount would be just the first of 4 family members to fall victim to Champ Ferguson's relentless killing spree. By the spring of 1862, Ferguson's name had become infamous. To locals, he was the very embodiment of the lawlessness and brutality of guerrilla warfare. His preferred method of execution, the knife, became the stuff of legend, exaggerated in pro-Union propaganda as something far worse. One particularly horrific tale spread like wildfire. In this version, Fount Zachary wasn't just shot, His arms were held down by Ferguson's men as Champ took his blade and sliced him open, spilling the boy's entrails into the dirt. Whether or not this was the actual truth didn't matter. The story struck terror into the hearts of many, and admiration into others. To his supporters, Ferguson was a hero, a necessary evil in a war where rules no longer applied. But for those who saw his work firsthand, there was little debate. With an estimated death toll of nearly 120 men by the end of the war, his reputation as a merciless killer was well earned. Just days after his first major raid in April, Ferguson found himself nearly captured by Union Colonel Frank Woolford and the 1st Kentucky Cavalry, the same unit that Champ's own brother, Jim, had enlisted with before his untimely death. Woolford's men stormed Ferguson's campsite, but somehow Champ received advanced warning and slipped away before the attack. The very next day, in a move as bold as it was reckless, he attempted to deceive the Union soldiers hunting him. Donning stolen blue uniforms, Ferguson and one of his men brazenly approached Woolford's squad, posing as fellow Union troops. For a moment, it seemed the ruse might work. Then, disaster. Someone recognized him. One of his companions surrendered. But Champ, he took off. Union soldiers pursued him relentlessly. The chase nearly cost him his life. Desperate, he abandoned his horse and vanished into the dense underbrush. But his thirst for revenge was far from quenched. On May 2nd, Ferguson joined forces once again with Scott Bledsoe for another ruthless raid into Kentucky. One of their first targets, the Huff family, a name Ferguson had not forgotten. Alexander Huff was a cousin of Champ's mother, and once upon a time, the two families had been on friendly terms. But the war changed everything. Alexander Huff had been one of the Union militiamen who captured Ferguson the previous year. They had attempted to haul him to Camp Dick Robinson, where he was to be forcibly enlisted in the Union Army. Ferguson, however, had managed to escape. From that moment on, the Huff family was on his list. A few months later, in a show of pure vengeance, Ferguson murdered two of his former Unionist friends, Reuben Wood and William Frog. Then he captured Alexander Huff's son Preston, only to become enraged when Confederate officials decided to release him. Ferguson nearly killed Preston right then and there. Confederate soldiers intervened, preventing a bloodbath, but Champ settled for stealing the young man's horse instead. As Preston departed, Ferguson promised that the Huff family was far from done paying their dues. Now, less than 5 months later, Champ made good on his word. According to trial testimony from Lucinda Huff, the scene was nothing short of chaos. Her father had been sitting in the yard when Champ's men arrived. He went into the house, she recalled, and then Jewett McGinnis told my father to come out. She watched in horror as John Smith, a member of Ferguson's group, raised his weapon, preparing to shoot. I caught hold of Smith, she said, and told him not to kill father. Champ reassured her. He shouldn't be hurt, he said. Go back in the house and do your work. She obeyed, but when she emerged later, her father was gone. Later, they found his body near the old Conrad Pile's place. What happened next was confirmed by multiple witnesses, including William B. Williams. He testified that Ferguson's men had taken him and Alexander Huff to the same location. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan, until gunfire rang out in the distance. Ferguson's men, spooked by what they believed was an approaching Union force, panicked. In the midst of the confusion, Ferguson made his move. Williams, standing beside Alexander Huff on the porch, recalled the chilling moment. "The first thing I knew," he said, "was I heard Ferguson tell me to get out of the way." Huff, realizing what was about to happen, raised his hands. "For God's sake, don't shoot me," he begged. Then he turned and dashed into the house, running for his life. Ferguson, enraged, shouted after his men, "Shoot him! Damn him! Shoot him!" The gunfire started almost immediately. Williams, terrified, ran into the house, hiding upstairs as the chaos unfolded below. What followed was a slaughter. Alexander Huff was shot at least a dozen times, but somehow he clung to life. He managed to crawl beneath an apple tree, bleeding profusely, deliriously begging for water. A neighbor, Nancy Brooks, bravely stepped forward to help, but Ferguson wasn't finished. He ordered one of his men, Smith, to finish the job. Despite the onlookers' desperate protests, Smith raised his weapon. The final shot went straight into the center of Alexander Huff's skull. According to Brian McKnight, the entire ordeal lasted anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, an act of deliberate, calculated cruelty. Yet Ferguson, even in the face of overwhelming eyewitness testimony, later denied any responsibility for Huff's murder. But when interviewed for the Nashville Union, he let the truth slip. "Alex Huff was killed by myself," he admitted, "and some of my men." And for Champ Ferguson, the bloodshed was far from over. Several days later, on May 4th, General John Hunt Morgan's Confederate cavalry, en route to Kentucky, made an overnight stop in Lebanon, Tennessee. A combination of poor weather and a dangerous sense of complacency among his men left them vulnerable. At dawn, Colonel Wolford's 1st Kentucky Cavalry launched a surprise attack, charging into the town and scattering Morgan's forces in disarray. Caught off guard, many Confederates fled to the outskirts, while Morgan and a portion of his men barely managed to escape across the Cumberland River. The chaotic retreat would later be known as the Lebanon Races. After regrouping, Morgan salvaged around 70 of his original 300 men. Finding himself in unfamiliar territory and significantly outnumbered, he sought reinforcements. He turned to local Confederate guerrilla fighters, including the notorious Champ Ferguson and his men. Reports suggest that Ferguson's reputation as a ruthless outlaw had already spread across the region, and Morgan's troops were eager to get a glimpse of the man whose name had become synonymous with bloodshed. With the addition of guerrilla fighters, including units led by Bledsoe and Captain Oliver P. Hamilton, the Confederate force more than doubled in size. Armed with this irregular's intimate knowledge of the terrain, Morgan and his men pressed forward toward Bowling Green. Their movement was anything but silent. Horns blared as they advanced northward, while home guard lookouts rushed to warn local Union supporters of the approaching enemy. On May 11th, Morgan's raiders struck a devastating blow to Union logistics. Capturing 2 trains, they set the first ablaze, its 49 boxcars reduced to a raging inferno, before being sent careening down the rails toward Nashville. The resulting explosion was nothing short of spectacular. The second train, however, presented a different opportunity. Discovering that it carried mostly women passengers, Morgan, ever the gentleman, allowed it to remain intact. Still, he made sure to seize $6,000 from the express agent and took several Union officers and soldiers prisoner. Meanwhile, Champ Ferguson, who had never formally enlisted in the Confederate Army, saw his proximity to Morgan as an opportunity to legitimize his violent raids. Though he occasionally fought alongside Confederate units, he never fully abandoned his brutal, irregular tactics, often ignoring the traditional rules of war. For a brief period in late May, Ferguson seemingly withdrew from raiding, returning to his home in White County, Tennessee. But by May 29th, he was back in action. That day, he and his men struck Albany, where they reportedly killed a man named Mr. Story, an act witnessed by a local farmer, John Long. Ferguson's killing spree continued, and his next victim was Elijah Cogar, a Home Guard commander who had long been a thorn in the side of Confederate guerrillas. Men like Cogar and other Unionists in the region had learned to adapt to the lawless nature of guerrilla warfare. Fighters such as Hiram Markham had taken to sleeping in fields and forests rather than inside their homes, hoping to evade enemy patrols. The previous year, Markham had been alerted to the presence of a Confederate raiding party by the screams of his wife and daughters. One of the raiders had stayed behind, intending to commit an atrocity against the women, but Markham, arriving just in time, managed to kill the man before he could carry out his crime. Cogar employed similar precautions, spending the warmer months sleeping in the mountains to avoid being caught at home. But on the morning of June 1st, his luck ran out. Champ Ferguson and 9 of his men arrived at Cogar's home, catching him off guard. Preston Huff, along with several Union scouts searching for Ferguson, later claimed to have witnessed the murder. However, some historians speculate that Huff may have exaggerated his testimony to strengthen the prosecution's case against Ferguson during his eventual trial. Regardless, the aftermath was undeniable. Huff later described the horrific scene. Louis Duval, Jonathan Williams, and Theophilus Williams were with me. We heard several guns fire and ran toward the sound. As we neared the road, we heard women screaming from Elijah Cogar's house. Then we saw a man climbing over a fence, only to fall backward, lifeless. When the shooting stopped, we approached the house. The man shot was Elijah Cogar. His little girl clung to his body, covered in his blood. It was a terrible sight. Champ Ferguson, however, saw things differently. To him, Cogar's death was nothing more than good riddance of bad rabbis. But Ferguson wasn't finished. Later that same day, he paid a visit to the farm of James Zachary, a magistrate in Fentress County and a former Home Guard member. Years earlier, Zachary's had played a role in Ferguson's imprisonment, an act the guerrilla leader had not forgotten. Whether it was for that old grievance, Zachary's Unionist ties, or the possibility that he might resurrect Ferguson's past murder charges after the war, the Confederate raider had come for blood. Ferguson caught Zachary outside his home, sending the magistrate sprinting through his own orchard in a desperate bid for survival. Watching from the porch, Zachary's daughter, Esther, held her breath. Unlike Cogar, her father had always carried a Colt Navy revolver, but fate was cruel. At some point during the chase, he lost his grip on the weapon. From her vantage point, Esther heard the gunshots ring out, followed by the chilling exchange between Ferguson and his men. "That's it, Champ. He's done for." When she finally approached her father's lifeless body, the sight was beyond gruesome. His head had been riddled with bullets. "It looked like jelly," she later recounted. For Ferguson, this was just another day in his war of vengeance. For the people of Tennessee, it was a stark reminder of the horrors that came when the thin line between soldier and outlaw was obliterated. As the sun began to rise over the quiet Kentucky hills, the gruesome handiwork of Champ Ferguson was laid bare in the muddy horse lot of the Pyle family home. The three bodies lay in contorted positions, their final moments betrayed by the violence inflicted upon them. John Williams had been executed with a single shot to the forehead, clean, precise, and merciless. William Delk, still bound, had been run through the chest, either with a bayonet or a knife, a final brutal punctuation to his fate. But it was John Crabtree who had suffered the most. Unlike the others, there were no gunshot wounds to mark his passing. Instead, his body bore the signs of a slow, agonizing death. His coat, once whole, was now a tattooed record of his suffering, each hole a testament to the 28 stab wounds he had endured. His arms were still bound tightly behind him, and the deep gash beneath his left shoulder blade suggested that he had been attacked from all angles, his captors showing no mercy. The scene was one of unrelenting horror. Blood had seeped into the dirt, pooling in the grooves of the earth, where horses had once trod. The silence that followed the gunshots was now filled only with the soft cries of the grieving. Young John Huff and the women had been left behind, forced to witness the aftermath of the massacre. Their steps were heavy as they walked toward the Pyle home, a place that had once been a safe haven, but was now the site of a fresh atrocity. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the morning dew. The women gasped at the sight before them, hands flying to their mouths in horror. John Huff stood frozen, his body rigid with shock and rage. This was not just war, it was slaughter, and Ferguson had made it clear this was personal. Lucinda Hatfield clenched her fists, trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. Her home had been ransacked, her family torn apart, and now 3 men lay dead, murdered in cold blood. She recalled Ferguson's words from the night before, his voice dripping with venom as he threatened to scatter Preston's body so completely that his family would never find enough to bury. This wasn't just revenge, it was something darker. Meanwhile, Ferguson and his men had vanished into the hills, their work complete. The slave girl they had taken was gone, her fate uncertain. Perhaps she had been sold off, as Ferguson had done with others before. Perhaps worse. The horrors left in his wake were not always recorded, but they were always felt. But if Ferguson believed he could act without consequence, he was wrong. The war was shifting, and even those who thrived in the shadows would soon find themselves exposed to the light. And when that day came, the reckoning would be as brutal as the crimes he had committed. As Crabtree's mother knelt beside her son's mutilated body, she gently removed the cornstalks that had been stuffed into his wounds, possibly while he was still alive. It was a grotesque sight, a final insult inflicted upon the dead or dying. Whether out of grief or disbelief, she said nothing. Champ Ferguson, meanwhile, spoke little of Williams, but freely admitted to killing Delk. His reasoning was as cold as it was simple. Delk had long hunted him, and killing him was the only way to save himself. But his justification for Crabtree's murder was even more twisted. Not only did he claim self-preservation, but he insisted Crabtree was a Union spy, and, in his mind, Federal generals executed spies all the time. Yet Ferguson couldn't keep his own story straight. In interviews with the Nashville Dispatch, he later stated that he hadn't killed Delk at all, but did admit to stabbing Crabtree. His reasoning shifted yet again. Now, Crabtree wasn't just a Union spy. He was a murderous villain who went into men's houses and shot them for their money. Whether Ferguson believed this or simply thought it made for a better excuse remains unknown. After leaving the Piles' home, Ferguson and his men rode into Wayne County, Kentucky. There, they came upon a traveling group of men and women, led by a man named Silas Upchurch. Ferguson wasted no time. He ordered Upchurch to step aside with his family, while two men, one white, named Orpheus Orf Williams, and one black, named Johnson Granville, were singled out. The two men had merely joined the traveling party, blending into the group for safety, but that didn't matter to Ferguson. One of his men demanded that Williams hand over his weapons. Williams complied, perhaps believing that surrendering his arms would spare his life. It did not. The moment the guns changed hands, Ferguson's men shot him dead. Granville was given no better treatment. His arms were bound, and he was led roughly 100 yards off the road. There, he was shot as well. Silas Upchurch later recalled what happened next. From his place on the road, he watched in horror as Ferguson approached Granville's lifeless body, drew his knife, and began mutilating the corpse, slashing at the man's chest and neck with deliberate practiced strokes. When he was satisfied, he wiped the blood from his blade onto his trousers as if it were nothing more than mud from the road. Ferguson's justification for these two killings. He claimed they were Union scouts, spies searching for his guerrilla band. The Nashville Union later reported that Granville had been a Union soldier, though no records confirmed this. Williams, on the other hand, may well have been a Union home guard. But there was one more disturbing possibility. That morning, Ferguson had already killed another man named John Williams. If the rumors were true, then Orf Williams, the man he had just gunned down, had died not as a soldier, not as a scout, but as the father of the man Ferguson had murdered only hours earlier. The killings did not stop there. A month later, another man was taken, Conrad Pyle. His crime, if he had one, was likely supporting the Union cause. On November 24th, Ferguson's men dragged him from his home, forced him along the road for 2 miles, and then executed him. He was shot 13 times. Then, as if death alone wasn't enough, they slashed his body open with a knife and left him in the road. With Union forces moving back into the Cumberland region, Ferguson's campaign of terror continued. 2 men, Preston Huff George and William Thrasher, were soldiers with Wolford's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. Like others before them, they had requested time off to visit their father. On the afternoon of October 27th, they never made it home. Champ Ferguson and 22 of his men ambushed the brothers, arrested them, and held them overnight. The next morning, Ferguson took a particular interest in William Thrasher, drawing him into conversation about a man named James Zachary, who had recently been killed. Zachary had been a Unionist, and some said he had died at the hands of Ferguson's men, but Ferguson scoffed at this idea. No, he said, that had been his kill. He's alone. As the prisoners were marched down the road, Ferguson's group came upon the farm of Washington Tabor, a man Ferguson believed to be a Union bushwhacker. George Thrasher later recalled what happened next. I looked out and saw Tabor coming up the lane on a horse. When he saw Tabor, Ferguson dismounted and went toward him, accusing him of ambushing and killing 3 of his men. Tabor got off his horse as Ferguson drew near. What followed was a brief, desperate plea for mercy. "Oh yes," Ferguson sneered, "you ought to die. You have done nothing to die for." Even as Tabor begged for his life, Ferguson was already drawing his pistol. He fired. The first shot struck Tabor in the chest. The second sent him crumpling to the ground, but even that wasn't enough. One of Ferguson's men encouraged him to finish the job properly. Ferguson obliged, putting a final bullet in the man's skull, just as Tabor's wife and daughter came running from the nearby house, screaming. The body was left where it fell. The group continued down the road, dragging the Thrasher brothers with them, but they wouldn't get far. Less than a mile away, Ferguson's party was ambushed. The attackers, a Union guerrilla force, led by a man who had long been a thorn in Ferguson's side, Elam Huddleston had gathered about 80 men. Ferguson had only 20, and if there was one Unionist besides Dave Beatty whom Ferguson despised, it was Huddleston. Ferguson had good reason. Huddleston and Beatty had teamed up before. In fact, Huddleston had been part of the mob that had tried to kill Ferguson before the war. The same ambush that had left Constable Reed dead. Now, the two men were meeting again. What followed was perhaps the largest skirmish to take place in Clinton County during the Civil War. And this time, for all his prowess, Ferguson and his men carried out their ruthless campaign. One particularly horrifying act stood out. Among their victims was Crabtree, a man whose body was found desecrated in a manner almost too grotesque to comprehend. Someone, possibly Ferguson himself, or one of his men, including Crabtree's own cousin, had stuffed cornstalks into his wounds, a gruesome spectacle that suggested he may have still been alive when the act was committed. His mother, overcome with grief, knelt beside her son's mutilated body, carefully removing the foreign objects as silent tears streamed down her face. Ferguson's justifications for these killings varied wildly. Regarding Williams, he said little, but he openly admitted to the murder of Dell, claiming it was an act of self-defense. Dell, he insisted, had been hunting him for some time, and Ferguson had to kill him first to save his own life. Crabtree's death, however, came with an even stranger explanation. Ferguson not only insisted it was necessary for his survival, but he also accused Crabtree of being a Union spy, comparing his execution to the way federal generals handled espionage. His statements seemed inconsistent, as he later denied killing Dell in an interview with the Nashville Dispatch, yet freely admitted to stabbing Crabtree. In another breath, he painted Crabtree as a murderer who ambushed men for their money, further twisting the narrative to fit his own ends. After their time at the Piles residence, Ferguson and his men pushed into Wayne County, Kentucky, where they encountered a traveling group led by Silas Upchurch. Ordering Upchurch to separate his family from the rest of the group, Ferguson's men singled out two men, one white named Orf Williams and one black named Granville Johnson. The two had merely been traveling with a larger group, unaware that they were about to meet their end. One of Ferguson's men demanded that Williams hand over his weapon. The moment he did, he was shot and killed on the spot. Granville Johnson was bound, his arms tied, and he was led about 100 yards away before they executed him as well. Silas Upchurch, watching in horror, later recounted that Ferguson himself mutilated Johnson's body, slashing at his chest and neck with a knife before wiping the blood onto his own trousers in a chilling display of brutality. When questioned later, Ferguson dismissed the murders as justified, claiming both men were Union scouts. While some sources suggested Johnson had been a Union soldier, there was no definitive proof. However, Orf Williams was suspected of being a part of the Union Home Guard. Worse still, some speculated he might have been the father of another of Ferguson's victims, John Williams, who had been killed that same morning. A month later, another victim, Conrad Pyle, was taken from his home. His fate was sealed on November 24th, when he was led 2 miles down the road and executed in an overwhelming display of violence. Shot 13 times and slashed across his body, Pyle's corpse was left abandoned on the roadside as a grim warning. As Union forces began reclaiming the Cumberland region, more names were added to Ferguson's growing list of victims. Among them were 2 brothers, Preston, half George, and William Thrasher, soldiers from Wolford's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. The pair had taken leave to visit their father, unaware that Ferguson and his men lay in wait. On October 27th, Ferguson and a group of 22 men ambushed and arrested them. The following morning, Ferguson engaged in conversation with William, discussing the recent death of James Zachary. When William mentioned that Zachary's sons, also soldiers, had been credited with the kill, Ferguson scoffed, insisting that he had been responsible for Zachary's death himself. The prisoners were then transported further along the road, where Ferguson encountered yet another of his targets, Washington Tabor. Ferguson accused Tabor of being a Union bushwhacker, someone who ambushed Confederate men. Tabor, realizing the gravity of the situation, dismounted his horse and pleaded for his life. Ferguson sneered. "You ought to die," he told Tabor. "You have done nothing to die for." Even as the man begged, Ferguson calmly pulled his pistol and shot him twice. Tabor crumpled to the ground, mortally wounded. One of Ferguson's men suggested finishing the job, and without hesitation, Ferguson fired the final shot into the man's skull. His wife and daughter, drawn by the gunfire, ran from the house screaming, only to find Tabor's lifeless body sprawled in the dirt. Ferguson and his men continued their march, dragging the Thrasher brothers along. They had traveled barely a mile when disaster struck. Union guerrilla leader Elam Huddleston and a force of 80 men ambushed Ferguson's small group. Huddleston had long been a thorn in Ferguson's side, a relentless adversary who, along with Dave Beatty, had been responsible for many Unionist raids. The skirmish that followed was one of the bloodiest to take place in Clinton County during the war. Ferguson had always been explicit in his orders. If a battle broke out, any prisoners were to be executed immediately. The Thrasher brothers knew their lives depended on the chaos of the fight, and in the confusion, they managed to escape into the trees. As Ferguson's death count continued to rise, rumors spread of yet another killing, this time involving Dr. McGlasson. The doctor, believing that Ferguson had murdered his brother, had publicly spoken out against him, even expressing his desire to see him prosecuted. Ferguson, unwilling to let such a challenge go unanswered, reportedly dragged McGlasson from his home at gunpoint, taunting him before offering him a twisted chance at survival. "Run for your life," Ferguson allegedly told him. McGlasson took off, sprinting towards safety, but he never stood a chance. Ferguson shot him down as he fled. Later, Ferguson denied killing the doctor, though he did admit to shooting an unnamed man who had been trying to escape over a fence. By December 1862, Ferguson and his men had become more than just an annoyance to the Union forces in the region. His growing reputation as a ruthless guerrilla leader caught the attention of Confederate cavalryman John Hunt Morgan. Ferguson saw an opportunity, an alliance with Morgan's raiders. Christmas found Ferguson riding north, with Morgan's men heading straight for a personal vendetta. 2 months earlier, Union guerrillas had attacked him, and now he planned his revenge. With 2 companies of Morgan's raiders at his command, Ferguson rode 40 miles through the bitter cold of New Year's Eve. Arriving at Elam Huddlestone's cabin just before midnight, they surrounded the home, waiting for the right moment to strike. One account, later written in a diary, claimed that Ferguson himself broke down the door, stormed inside, and stabbed Huddlestone before he could rise from his cot. Dragging him into the yard, Ferguson allegedly slit his throat. However, a more credible version of events suggests that Huddlestone's brother, Moses, first spotted Ferguson's men peering through the window, raising the alarm. Elam, Moses, and their cousin David scrambled upstairs to retrieve their guns, and a chaotic gunfight erupted. The women and children huddled below, desperately smothering the flames as Ferguson's men attempted to set fire to the house. Within an hour, Elam had been mortally wounded. Hoping to save him, Moses called out, offering their surrender. A Confederate officer assured them of their safety, but the moment Moses pulled his injured brother outside, Ferguson stepped forward and shot Elam in cold blood. His revenge complete, Ferguson and his men looted the house before departing, though some of Morgan's men showed an ounce of decency, helping the family smother the fire. Ferguson's ruthlessness knew no bounds. The cycle of bloodshed was far from over. The following day, seeking to boast about his recent exploits, Ferguson paid a visit to an injured Confederate acquaintance, none other than Colonel Basil Duke, the brother-in-law of John Hunt Morgan. Duke, who had been wounded early in the previous night's skirmish, had missed most of the carnage. With a twisted sense of pride, Ferguson presented his knife, still stained with dried blood, recounting his latest act of brutality. Duke, despite his own reputation as a hardened soldier, later admitted that the sight of the bloodied blade, coupled with Ferguson's chilling tale, thoroughly nauseated him. By the early 1863, Ferguson's name had become an easy target for pro-Union propagandists. His reputation for unrestrained violence spread rapidly, drawing attention from both military and political circles. Determined to put an end to his rampage, Union commanders intensified their search efforts, deploying scout units deep into the rugged highlands in a relentless pursuit of Ferguson and his men. With the weight of the Union Army pressing down on him, Ferguson temporarily set aside his personal vendettas, focusing instead on evading capture. A passage from historian Brian McKnight's work provides insight into how Ferguson viewed his role in the war and how the public perceived him. The guerrilla war waged by Ferguson and Morgan often strayed far from conventional military discipline, frequently descending into outright criminality. Bank robberies, thefts at gunpoint, and attacks on private citizens were all part of their operations. To Ferguson, he and his compatriots, Morgan and Basil Duke, were exiled Kentuckians, fighting not just for the Confederacy, but for their homes and families, which they saw as under siege by foreign aggressors. However, beyond ideology, Ferguson and Morgan were also driven by personal ambition, the pursuit of wealth and power. In the post-war years, both men were remembered as martyrs for the Southern cause, their legacies wrapped in layers of nostalgia and romanticized heroism. Yet, as time passed, historians became more willing to scrutinize the reality behind the myth. Ferguson's habit of looting money, firearms, horses, and clothing from friend and foe alike is extensively documented. painting a picture that contrasts sharply with the image of a noble Confederate warrior. For the first 4 months of 1863, Ferguson's activities faded from the historical record, with only a single notable mention. A letter penned by a writer identified as J.O. of Lebanon and published in the Louisville Daily Journal accused Ferguson and his men of being responsible for the deaths of 50 citizens in Clinton County. According to J.O., with most of the county's fighting-age men conscripted into the Union Army, Ferguson had found an easy and defenseless population to terrorize. Over the next 2 years, Ferguson's guerrilla band grew in size, sometimes swelling to dozens or even hundreds of men. They continued to harass Union forces, occasionally joining forces with other Confederate cavalry regiments. Meanwhile, Morgan's command faced relentless Union pressure, forcing them north into Ohio. Morgan's infamous raid came to an abrupt end on July 26, 1863, when he surrendered to Union forces near the small village of West Point, Ohio. During this time, Ferguson remained largely inactive, spending much of the summer in Sparta, Tennessee, as the war escalated around him. Ferguson resurfaced in the fall of 1863, joining Confederate Colonel George G. Dibrell's 8th Tennessee Cavalry. He may have also worked alongside Colonel John Hughes' forces. A letter dated October 24, 1863, written by a correspondent identified as MDC, placed Ferguson in Greensburg and Munfordville, Kentucky, during what became known as the Munfordville Raid. According to the letter, Ferguson and his men arrived in Munfordville under cover of darkness, immediately launching a spree of looting and destruction. What began as the ransacking of a Unionist's home quickly escalated into a full-blown raid on the town. By the time they left, Ferguson's men had stolen approximately $14,000 worth of goods, plundering from Unionists and Confederate sympathizers alike. The writer noted that the guerrillas had even robbed a man of a mere 11 cents, but were apparently too prideful to return it, considering it beneath them to insult him with charity. A similar attack soon followed in Adair County, where Ferguson's men showed no discrimination in their victims, robbing anyone they encountered, regardless of political affiliation or social status. Even slaves were harassed just as freely as prominent Confederates, including the son-in-law of former Kentucky Governor Beriah McGoffin, a well-known supporter of the Southern cause. Eyewitnesses reported that, surprisingly, Ferguson appeared to be the most restrained among the raiders, though this offered little comfort to those who fell victim to the violence. As the winter of 1863 set in, Union military leaders grew increasingly frustrated. Complaints and requests for reinforcements poured in as Confederate guerrilla violence spiraled further out of control. Ferguson's band continued its raids, siphoning off desperately needed supplies from the war-torn region. The war was entering its bloodiest phase, and Ferguson showed no signs of slowing down. 1864. By this time in the war, guerrilla fighters had become infamous. To some they were ruthless but effective warriors. To others, especially senior officers from both the Union and Confederate armies, they were nothing short of outlaws. And among these feared irregulars, one name stood out above the rest: Champ Ferguson. In February of 1864, Federal Colonel William B. Stokes sent a chilling message to all known bushwhackers. There would be no quarter, no surrender, no mercy. To many, this was the only way to deal with men like Ferguson. But interestingly, Stokes himself was a paradox. According to historian Brian McKnight, Stokes had actually supported secession before the war. Yet, when the conflict erupted, he chose to remain loyal to the Union. In a way, he was the perfect antithesis to Champ Ferguson. Unsurprisingly, guerrilla leaders took serious issue with Stokes' refusal to accept their surrender. To men like Ferguson, the response to such a policy was clear: sheer brutality. Captured Union soldiers and officers would face fate so gruesome that even hardened veterans recoiled at the stories. As the war raged on, Federal troops made it their mission to destroy guerrilla networks. Union raids targeted their homes, reclaiming stolen horses, weapons, and supplies. On two separate occasions in January, Union forces confiscated valuables from Ferguson's Tennessee property, but Ferguson himself remained a ghost. Unable to locate him or other notorious guerrillas, the Union shifted its focus toward the Cumberland region, launching an all-out campaign to root them out. But the conflict had already taken its toll. Reports from the time describe a civilian population teetering on the brink of famine. The relentless raiding by both Union and Confederate irregulars had left the people with little food or resources. Political allegiance no longer mattered. Unionists and Confederate sympathizers alike were starving. Then came February 13th, 1864. Now, back in Tennessee, and with Colonel Stokes closing in, Ferguson and his men arrived at the farm of Isham Richards in Fentress County. They had reason to believe that three Unionist men, Jackson Garner, James Templeton, and Dallas Beatty, the son of famed Union guerrilla fighter Tinker Dave Beatty, were hiding there. What happened next was later testified in chilling detail by a witness named Columbus German. According to German, Ferguson found young Dallas Beatty cowering behind a woodpile. With a sinister calm, Ferguson raised his gun, looked the boy in the eye, and asked, "Do you want to eat the powder?" Then he pulled the trigger. Next, Ferguson turned to Jackson Garner, ordering him out of the house. A desperate plea came from inside. Someone begged Ferguson not to kill Garner indoors, fearing the mess. Ferguson's response was as cruel as it was casual. If anyone questioned him again, they would be the next to die. Garner was marched onto the porch. Ferguson shot him twice. As for James Templeton, his fate remains a mystery. He was taken prisoner, but no testimony ever revealed what became of him. Tensions between guerrillas and Union forces had now reached a fever pitch. When Colonel Stokes issued his no-surrender order, Ferguson responded the only way he knew how, with bloodshed. The Battle of Dug Hill was an ambush. Ferguson and his men trapped 60 Union soldiers in a narrow gorge. As gunfire erupted from above, the Confederates hurled heavy rocks down onto the trapped Federals. Survivors were shown no mercy. Some had their throats slit, their heads nearly severed from ear to ear. Of the approximately 110 Union men in the battle, fewer than 50 managed to escape into the hills. Ferguson's later indictment would claim that at least 19 of those who tried to surrender were hanged. Ferguson, however, denied any involvement. Yet, later interviews suggest otherwise. His statements to the press often contradicted his courtroom testimony. Then, in March of 1864, Ferguson finally met an adversary he couldn't overpower, a bullet. During a skirmish with Federal troops, Ferguson was shot in the abdomen. The wound should have been fatal. Rumors quickly spread. Some claimed Ferguson had died of his injuries, others that he had been executed while bedridden. One particularly dramatic newspaper report even described Ferguson's lifeless body riddled with bullets as he lay helpless in bed. But none of it was true. Ferguson was alive, and by mid-July, he proved it by stealing more than 100 US cavalry horses from a Union pasture. Then, just as quickly as he had reappeared, he vanished again, retreating deep into the Kentucky mountains, where he remained for the rest of the summer, and the violence only escalated. By September 1864, the Union's no-quarter policy had set the stage for one of the war's most horrific massacres. It happened in Centralia, Missouri, and it wasn't Ferguson who led it. It was a man whose reputation was somehow even darker. His name was William Anderson, or, as history remembers him, Bloody Bill. As the battle for Saltville loomed, the atmosphere grew tense. Ferguson and his fellow Tennesseans found themselves directly in the path of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, a unit composed of black soldiers fighting for their freedom. To Ferguson and his men, this was no ordinary battle. It was personal. The morning of October 2nd, 1864, dawned under an eerie stillness. The Confederate defenders, many of them young, barely trained recruits, huddled behind hastily constructed barricades. Across the battlefield, the Union forces advanced, their eyes set on securing the vital salt works. But for Ferguson, this was not just about salt, nor was it about strategy. It was about vengeance. As the first shots rang out, the battlefield erupted into chaos. The 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, determined and disciplined, surged forward against the hail of Confederate gunfire. Bullets tore through the ranks. Soldiers fell, but they pressed on, refusing to yield. Ferguson and his men fired relentlessly, cutting down wave after wave of Union soldiers. The air grew thick with smoke, the scent of gunpowder mixing with the stench of blood. And then, the Confederate lines held. The Union assault faltered. The battle was over, but for Ferguson, the real slaughter had only just begun. Under the cover of night, he and his men combed the battlefield, seeking out the wounded and the dying. The Union survivors, many of them badly injured, had been left behind in the retreat, defenseless, at the mercy of their captors. Ferguson showed none. One by one, the wounded soldiers were dragged from the field hospitals and summarily executed. Some were shot where they lay. Others, less fortunate, met far grislier ends. Testimonies from the aftermath painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Bayonets driven through broken bodies, throats slashed, skulls crushed beneath the butts of rifles. And yet, as brutal as the massacre was, Ferguson showed no remorse. To him, these men were nothing more than traitors, unworthy of the battlefield's honor. The bloodbath at Saltville was not just another skirmish in the Civil War. It was an atrocity, a crime that would not be forgotten. In the days that followed, word of Ferguson's brutality spread. The Union Army, enraged, vowed that his time was coming to an end. His name, once whispered in fear, was now written on every wanted poster across the South. The man who had spent the war dealing death would soon find himself hunted like an animal. And for the first time, Champ Ferguson had nowhere left to run. The bloody aftermath. As dawn broke over Saltville, the battlefield was eerily silent, save for the groans of the wounded scattered among the dead. For most conflicts, the close of battle marked the end of the violence. But Saltville was different. The real nightmare was just beginning. Confederate soldiers, still seething with rage, moved methodically through the carnage, stepping over bodies, searching for survivors. But they weren't offering aid. They were delivering death. Many of the wounded were black Union soldiers, men of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, who had fought with every ounce of strength they had, only to be left behind when the Federal forces retreated. Now, they were at the mercy of men who had none. Henry Shocker, a soldier of the 12th Ohio Cavalry, lay among the bodies, wounded but conscious. He watched in horror as a shadow loomed over him. Champ Ferguson, the notorious guerrilla fighter, strolled through the field with his revolver drawn, his eyes scanning for any signs of life. He stopped near a fellow wounded soldier, Crawford Henselwood, a Union trooper too injured to fight, barely able to lift his head. Ferguson sneered. "What are you doing here? Why'd you come down here to fight with this den?" His words trailed off, but the intent was clear. Henselwood, desperate, pleaded for his life, but Ferguson had no interest in mercy. "Where do you want it?" he asked coldly. "Back or in the face?" Before Henselwood could answer, the gun roared. His body slumped to the ground, lifeless. Shocker, still playing dead, held his breath as Ferguson's bullets passed inches from him. He could hear the guerrilla's footsteps fading, then stopping at a small log building nearby, the makeshift hospital where other wounded soldiers had been taken. Shocker dared not move, but his ears remained sharp. Minutes passed, then the sound of gunfire erupted again. More executions. Soon after, Ferguson emerged, dragging two black Union soldiers out of the hospital. He led them a few yards away before raising his revolver and gunning them down. Then without hesitation, he turned back inside to retrieve two more, and he did the same to them. It wasn't enough. 4 days later, under the cover of darkness, Ferguson and his men ascended the stairs of Wiley Hall, Atemory, and Henry College. Once a place of learning, the building had been converted into a hospital for wounded Union prisoners. Inside, the air was thick with sickness and suffering. Men lay in beds, wrapped in bloodied bandages, too weak to fight back. Ferguson burst into one of the rooms, a candle illuminating his face as his revolver gleamed in the dim light. His men followed close behind. They scanned the wounded prisoners, searching for someone. One of them shook his head. "None of them are here." Disappointed but undeterred, Ferguson turned away, only to be drawn by movement in the next room. A black soldier, wrapped in his sheet, stumbled in, eyes wide with terror. He had seen what Ferguson had done. He knew what was coming. Without hesitation, Ferguson strode forward and pulled the trigger. The soldier collapsed, his body lifeless, before it hit the ground. Another shot, another man, dead in his hospital bed. The massacre at Saltfield was a war crime, but Ferguson saw it as nothing more than unfinished business. His hatred ran so deep, his bloodlust so insatiable, that he refused to let wounded men die on their own. He had to be the one to finish them, the man who sealed Ferguson's fate. For all his brutality, there was one man Ferguson should have feared: Elsa Smith, a lieutenant in the 13th Kentucky Cavalry. Smith knew Ferguson better than most. He wasn't just an enemy soldier. He was family, by marriage at least, but blood ties meant nothing now. Smith had seen enough, heard enough, and when the war finally drew to a close, he made sure Ferguson would answer for his crimes. And for the first time in his life, Champ Ferguson found himself on the wrong end of a gun. The Federals managed to push the Confederate force back up the hill where they had entrenched themselves. As the battle raged on, something remarkable happened. When the black soldiers in the Union ranks began climbing the hill, the Confederates, many of whom harbored deep-seated racial hatred, reacted with fury. Historian Brian McKnight writes that William C. Davis described the Confederate 8th Tennessee, commanded by Jacob DeBrell, as becoming exasperated, with several men allowing their raids to overtake reason. They abandoned the security of their entrenchments just to engage a black soldier in personal combat. Despite their reckless attacks, the Confederates put up a determined resistance. With the Federals running low on ammunition, they were forced to withdraw by 5 p.m. But the battle itself was only part of the horror that unfolded at Saltville. Most battles end when the gunfire stops. But at Saltville, the real terror began the next morning. Confederate soldiers roaming the battlefield began executing wounded enemy troops, most of whom were black soldiers. While no single individual was immediately named in official reports, later testimony would paint a grim picture of what took place. At the trial of notorious Confederate guerrilla Champ Ferguson in 1865, an eyewitness, Henry Shocker of the 12th Ohio Cavalry, placed Ferguson at the site of the massacre. Shocker recalled the chilling moment when he saw Ferguson standing over wounded prisoners, his revolver aimed downward. Shocker himself had been wounded the previous evening and lay motionless, feigning death as Ferguson slowly approached. A few feet away, another wounded Union soldier, Crawford Henselwood, was not so lucky. Ferguson spotted him and sneered, "What are you doing here? Why did you come down here to fight with the damned?" Before Henselwood could finish pleading for his life, Ferguson coldly pulled the trigger. Shocker held his breath as Ferguson walked past, stepping into a nearby log building that had been converted into a makeshift hospital. Moments later, 2 black Union soldiers were dragged outside. "Wait and see what he does with them," murmured a nearby Confederate soldier. Shocker didn't have to wait long. Ferguson executed both men on the spot. Then, as if performing some grotesque ritual, he went back inside and brought out 2 more, killing them in the same brutal fashion. While some later tried to defend Ferguson, claiming he was misunderstood or that accounts of his brutality were exaggerated, his actions at Saltville are well documented. Among the witnesses was William H. Gardner, a sergeant in the 30th Kentucky Infantry. Captured or left behind by his unit, Gardner was inside the hospital treating wounded soldiers when Ferguson stormed in. Without hesitation, the guerrilla fighter singled out 5 black soldiers and shot them at point-blank range. But Ferguson wasn't finished. Days later, on the night of October 7th, he and his men entered Wiley Hall at Emory and Henry College, another makeshift hospital filled with wounded prisoners. Orange Sells, a member of the 12th Ohio Cavalry, was recovering in one of the rooms when 3 armed men burst in, holding a candle and scanning the faces of the injured. They were searching for someone specific. After inspecting each bed, one of the men muttered, "None of them are here," and left. Seconds later, gunfire erupted from the next room. A black soldier, wrapped in a blood-stained sheet, stumbled in, terror in his eyes. Ferguson had found 2 wounded black troops and executed them in their beds. These events became known as the Saltville Massacre, an atrocity so appalling that even Confederate General Robert E. Lee condemned it. He later stated that he was much pained to hear of the treatment of black prisoners and agreed with those who denounced it. Ferguson, however, denied any involvement, yet multiple eyewitnesses from both the Union and Confederate sides placed him at the scene, his revolver still warm from the bloodshed. By early 1865, With his reputation as a ruthless guerrilla cemented, Ferguson and his men rejoined General Joseph Wheeler, following in the footsteps of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman as he carved his way through Georgia and South Carolina. But the war was nearing its end. Around February 1st, Ferguson was ordered back to Waithville, Virginia, where he was imprisoned for 2 months as Confederate authorities attempted to investigate the Saltville killings. Yet, even the Confederate Army struggled with what to do about him. Officially, Ferguson was not a Confederate soldier, but an irregular combatant, essentially an outlaw. Efforts to bring him to justice faltered as witnesses became harder to locate, and as the war spiraled toward its conclusion, Ferguson's crimes became a secondary concern. By April 4th, he was acquitted and released. 5 days later, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, but Ferguson wasn't done. In the final weeks of the war, as the South crumbled, he abandoned formal military action and returned to his old ways, hunting down Union supporters in Kentucky and Tennessee. One of his first targets, his longtime enemy, Tinker Dave Beatty. Spotting Beatty in Ventress County, Tennessee, Ferguson and his men ambushed him as he stopped at a friend's home for a meal. Guns drawn, they arrested him, but as they transported him down the road, Beatty suddenly spun his horse and bolted. Gunfire rang out. 3 bullets hit their mark, but none were fatal. Beatty lived to fight another day. By the end of April, Ferguson was still at large, his thirst for vengeance unquenched. On either April 30th or May 1st, he and more than a dozen of his men rode onto the Duval farm. 2 brothers, Martin Van Buren Duval and L.W. Bug Duval, stood watching alongside their friend, John Hurt. They knew why Ferguson was there, and they knew what was coming. The war was ending, but for Ferguson, the killing was far from over. By late May 1865, the tide had fully turned against men like Champ Ferguson. The war was all but over, yet pockets of violence still flared in the South, and federal authorities were determined to rid the region of its most notorious bushwhackers. Ferguson, having surrendered under the same terms given to Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Joseph E. Johnston, believed he was free to return to his home. But what he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the Union government had already decided his fate. Unlike the other surrendering Confederates, he would not be allowed to simply walk away. On May 26, 1865, just 2 days after he was assured safe passage, 5 federal soldiers arrived at Ferguson's farm in White County, Tennessee. They found him unprepared, perhaps already settling back into the life he had known before the war. He was tied to his own horse and taken to Nashville, where he would stand trial for what the government now labeled as war crimes. The trial began on July 11, 1865, and stretched for months, captivating the public. Newspapers across the country carried updates, painting Ferguson as either a cold-blooded murderer or a misunderstood soldier. In the courtroom, his past came back to haunt him. One by one, witnesses took the stand, family members of the men he had killed, old enemies, and even some of his former comrades. His longtime rival, Tinker Dave Beatty, was among them, no doubt relishing the chance to see his nemesis finally answer for his crimes. In total, Ferguson faced accusations of 53 murders. When asked, he did not deny his violent past. In fact, he admitted to killing many of them, more than 100 by his own estimate, but he insisted that his actions were not murder. "I done it as a soldier," he declared. standing firm in his belief that he had simply been following the brutal rules of war. Yet the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness after witness recalled scenes of horror, recounting how Ferguson had slaughtered unarmed men, executed prisoners, and butchered the wounded in hospital beds. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when a woman stood up in the courtroom, tears streaming down her face. She was the daughter of Reuben Wood, a man Ferguson had killed years earlier. Pointing directly at Ferguson, she screamed, "That man murdered my father!" The room fell silent as she walked forward and revealed scars on the side of Ferguson's head, marks left by her father's hatchet during his desperate struggle before being shot to death. Ferguson, usually unshaken, visibly flinched under the weight of the accusation. The trial was about more than just Champ Ferguson. In the wake of the Confederacy's collapse, the North was looking for scapegoats, and Ferguson, alongside Confederate Major Henry Wirz, the infamous commander of Andersonville Prison, became a symbol of Southern brutality. The nation was still reeling from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and there was a thirst for retribution. Ferguson, whose name had long been whispered in fear across Tennessee and Kentucky, became one of the most convenient targets. When it came time for his defense, Ferguson had few allies left. He managed to call only a handful of character witnesses, men who had once ridden with him, but now hesitated to speak on his behalf. They were either too afraid or unwilling to align themselves with the condemned man. Ferguson later called the trial a farce, insisting he had never stood a chance. But the verdict was inevitable. On October 10, 1865, Champ Ferguson was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. The ruling came as no surprise, least of all to Ferguson himself. If anything, he seemed resigned to his fate. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no escape, no mercy. His execution was scheduled for October 20th. In the days leading up to it, he remained calm, even defiant. Reporters who visited him in his cell described him as a man unrepentant, still believing he had only done what was necessary. He told them he was not afraid to die. And so, on a cool autumn morning, Champ Ferguson was led to the gallows in Nashville. A crowd gathered, some there for justice, others simply for the spectacle. He walked with a steady stride, refusing to show weakness. When asked for any final words, he merely shook his head. The noose was placed around his neck. The trapdoor beneath him swung open, and with that, one of the Civil War's most infamous guerrilla fighters was gone. His death did not erase his legacy. In the years that followed, some in the South remembered him as a hero, a man who had fought and killed for his home, no matter how brutal his methods. Others saw him for what he truly was, a ruthless killer, a man who had crossed the line between soldier and executioner too many times to be forgiven. But whatever one believed about Champ Ferguson, one thing was certain. His story was not just one of war, but of vengeance, of violence unchecked, and of a man who, in the end, could not escape the bloodshed he had spent his life embracing. And so, his name lives on, not as a hero, nor as a soldier, but as a legend of the dark and brutal chaos that was the American Civil War. As Champ Ferguson's trial dragged on through the humid months of the Tennessee summer in 1865, the list of witnesses called against him grew longer by the day. One by one, they took the stand, each offering damning testimony of his brutality. But among them stood a figure that, at least on the surface, seemed to offer some measure of credibility in Ferguson's favor. His former commander, General Joseph Wheeler. Wheeler, a distinguished Confederate cavalry officer, had only encountered Ferguson in the final stretch of the war, beginning in August 1864. His testimony was limited, unable to either fully condemn or exonerate the accused guerrilla leader. He stated that, in his understanding, Ferguson had functioned as an officer in the Confederate Army. Whether or not any official documentation existed to prove that claim was another matter entirely. Regardless of Wheeler's words, the weight of the prosecution's evidence had already made Ferguson's fate clear. On September 26th, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty. 2 weeks later, on October 10th, the official sentencing was issued, death by hanging. There would be no further deliberation, no chance of appeal. By then, Ferguson's world had already crumbled around him. Throughout the war, his name had become synonymous with bloodshed, and the very same notoriety that had once struck fear into the hearts of his enemies now sealed his fate. His family, already fractured by years of violence, distanced themselves in his final days. None came to visit him in his cell, none except for his wife and daughter. But even as the gallows loomed, a flicker of hope remained. President Andrew Johnson, who had taken office following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, was inundated with letters pleading for Ferguson's life. Some came from ordinary citizens who believed his crimes had been exaggerated. Others were more personal, including one from Johnson's own nephew, James, who had been assigned as Ferguson's prison guard during his trial. These letters carried an ironic weight. Johnson, before becoming president, had served as the wartime governor of Tennessee, the same governor whom Ferguson had allegedly once been hired to assassinate for a bounty of $1,000. Now, he alone had the power to decide whether the infamous bushwhacker lived or died, but Johnson remained silent. The requests for clemency were ignored. On the morning of October 20th, 1865, Champ Ferguson was led from his cell to the gallows at the Nashville Penitentiary. The Cincinnati Commercial later published an account of the execution, describing the moment in haunting detail. Champ Ferguson was executed at noon today at the penitentiary grounds just outside the city. He stood composedly on the draw, some 20 minutes, while the charges, specifications, and sentence were read by Colonel Shafter. He nodded recognition to several persons in the crowd and shifted his position in an impatient manner while the sentence was being read. Though outwardly calm, Ferguson's reactions betrayed his inner turmoil. When he heard certain accusations, some of which were exaggerated, others painfully true, he subtly shook his head in denial. But when the name of one of his alleged victims, Ellen Huddleston, was read aloud, Ferguson interrupted. "I could tell it better than that," he muttered. The execution proceeded without delay. A final prayer was offered, and Ferguson's spiritual advisor urged him to seek forgiveness in his final moments. When asked if he had any last words, Ferguson hesitated. "Nothing to say in particular at all," he said. I don't think I have." Then came the moment he had spent the past weeks preparing for. The noose was placed around his neck. For the first time, his composure cracked. His face flushed deep red, sweat poured from his brow, and his lips trembled as the full weight of his fate settled upon him. His courage, so resolute through years of bloodshed, now faltered. Colonel Shafter, perhaps out of sympathy, stepped forward and wiped the sweat from Ferguson's face. Slowly, the condemned asserted himself once more. According to one account, Ferguson whispered something to Shafter, a final, quiet plea. The words were never recorded, but whatever was spoken in that brief, private moment seemed to give him a measure of peace. Then aloud, he made the last request. "I want to be put in that thing," he said, pointing to the waiting coffin. "Taken to White County, where I can have my family around me." A pause. "If I'd only had my way, I wouldn't have been here." He shifted slightly, his breathing shallow. "My last request is to be sent away with my wife." At last, a white hood was placed over his head. His voice, muffled through the cloth, uttered his final words. "Good Lord, have mercy on my soul." At 17 minutes to noon, the trapdoor swung open. Despite the official record stating that Champ Ferguson was executed on October 20th, 1865, whispers of an alternate fate have persisted for generations. According to historian Brian McKnight, the Confederate defeat brought increased scrutiny to guerrilla warfare, exposing the brutal realities of men like Ferguson. Yet, the Union victory often obscured similar acts of violence committed by pro-Union fighters. This double standard was evident in how the press covered the conflict. While Ferguson was condemned as a monstrous criminal, his Union counterpart, David Beatty, was celebrated as a heroic scout. Had the circumstances been reversed, some argued, Beatty and others like him might have faced the same fate as Ferguson. To Ferguson, the world was a battlefield, divided into two clear groups, friends and enemies. Friends were to be protected at all costs, while enemies were to be eliminated without hesitation. Even as the noose tightened around his future, he defended his actions, claiming they were necessary for his survival. But was Champ Ferguson's execution as final as history records? In 1942, Otho Thurman Sensing, a World War II Navy veteran, published Champ Ferguson, Confederate Guerrilla. When the book was reprinted in 1994, Sensing's son added an afterword that reignited the mystery surrounding Ferguson's death. Sensing recalled a moment from his childhood in 1941 when he and his father traveled to Ferguson's supposed burial site in White County, Tennessee. "I thought I had found Champ back then," he wrote. "But maybe I was wrong." Why? Because according to an old story printed in the Cookeville Herald-Citizen, Ferguson's execution may have been a carefully staged deception. The legend suggests that certain Union military officials believed Ferguson should not have been hanged, as many men guilty of similar acts had been granted parole. A secret agreement was allegedly reached, one that ensured his survival. On the day of his execution, the theory goes, the base of the gallows was enclosed, concealing the view beneath the scaffold. Soldiers formed a tight perimeter around the site, allowing no one to see what happened when the trapdoor swung open. As Ferguson dropped, the story claims, the hangman's knot had been intentionally tied loosely. Rather than choking to death, Ferguson was quickly freed, placed inside a waiting coffin, and loaded onto a wagon. His wife and daughter, already stationed nearby, drove the coffin out of Nashville. Once far enough from prying eyes, the tale continues. Ferguson emerged alive. The family supposedly traveled westward, disappearing into Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, where they assumed new identities, living out their days as farmers and ranchers. It's a fantastic story, but if true, it leaves one unsettling question. Who then is buried in the grave marked Captain C. Ferguson in White County? Even the headstone raises doubts. Ferguson's name is misspelled. an error that seems unlikely for his own family to make. Did his wife, Martha, not know how to spell his name? Or was the grave simply a decoy, a carefully placed deception meant to complete the illusion of his execution? And what of the final moments on the gallows? Eyewitnesses recalled Ferguson appearing deeply nervous until Colonel Shafter, the officer in charge, leaned in and whispered something to him in a low tone. Almost instantly, Ferguson's expression changed. His fear vanished, replaced by something else. Relief? What had Shafter told him? Was it a message of reassurance, a confirmation that the plan was in place? These are questions that may never be answered. The records remain unchanged, and history insists that Ferguson met his end that day in Nashville. But as long as stories like these continue to circulate, the legend of Champ Ferguson will never truly die. And perhaps neither did he. One of the key witnesses during Champ Ferguson's trial was his former commander, General Joseph Wheeler. However, as historian Brian McKnight notes, Wheeler had no prior experience with Ferguson before August 1864. His testimony only confirmed that during the final phase of the war, Ferguson was considered an officer in the Confederate Army, regardless of whether official documentation existed. On September 26th, the jury reached its verdict. Ferguson was guilty. By October 10th, General Orders officially affirmed his conviction and sentenced him to death by hanging. Despite his years of service to the Confederacy, Ferguson found himself abandoned in his final days. None of his relatives visited him while he awaited execution, except for his wife and daughter. The strain that the war had placed on the Ferguson family was evident. Following Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson was inundated with letters requesting clemency for Ferguson. Among them was a plea from his own nephew, James, who had served as Ferguson's prison guard during the trial. But Johnson remained unmoved. Ironically, this was the same man whom Ferguson had once allegedly agreed to assassinate for a $1,000 bounty back when Johnson was governor of Tennessee. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was justice, but either way, Johnson ignored all requests to pardon Ferguson or reduce his sentence. A Cincinnati commercial article dated October 20th, 1865, described the execution in chilling detail. Champ Ferguson was executed at noon today at the penitentiary grounds just outside the city. He stood composedly on the drop for 20 minutes while the charges, specifications, and sentence were read aloud by Colonel Shafter. Ferguson nodded in recognition to several people in the crowd and shifted his stance impatiently. When certain charges were read, he inclined his head in agreement. At others, he shook his head. When the charge concerning Ellen Huddleston was announced, Ferguson spoke up. "I could tell it better than that." And when the speaker read the line, "To all of which the prisoner pleads not guilty," Ferguson interrupted. "I don't now." A prayer was offered by his spiritual advisor. Then Ferguson was asked if he had any last words. His response was simple. "Nothing to say in particular at all. I don't think I have." Then the noose was placed around his neck. For the first time, his composure cracked. His face flushed deep red. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, and his lips quivered. The reality of his fate had struck him. Colonel Shafter, standing nearby, reached over and wiped the sweat from Ferguson's face. Slowly, Ferguson regained his composure. According to reports from the Nashville Dispatch and Louisville Daily Journal, he whispered something to Shafter, a quiet exchange that seemed to lift his spirits. though what he said remains unknown. The Cincinnati commercial article continues. For a moment or two, he seemed to be repressing an impulse to make further remarks. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "I want to be sent to my family. I don't want to be buried on this soil." Another pause. Then, in an excited tone, he continued, "Don't give me to the doctors. I don't want to be cut up." A silence followed. Then he spoke again, this time pointing to his coffin. "I want to be put in that thing, taken to White County, where I can have my family around me. If I'd only had my way, I wouldn't have been here. Whenever you're ready, I'm done. My last request is to be sent away with my wife." A white hood was placed over his head. Through the cloth, his final words could still be heard. "Good Lord, have mercy on my soul." At precisely 11:43 a.m., the drop fell.